You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 16th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The US presidential election out-crazies itself yet again. What is China hoping to gain by throwing its considerable weight around the South China Sea? And Spain and Portugal offer one model for resolving border disputes. Not caring. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Latika Burke and Andrew Thompson will discuss today's big stories, and we'll hear from New York Times diplomatic correspondent Edward Wong about chronicling China's extraordinary changes through the experiences of one family, his own. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Andrew Thompson, Latin America specialist and Latin news contributor, and Latika Burke, journalist and geopolitics expert. Hello to you both.
Hello, Andrew.
Hello.
Andrew, first of all, you have, as I understand it, recently been visiting, I don't know which age it was, the Stone Age, Iron Age, Bronze Age, one of the ages. You went there.
Yes, most of those ages. It's a place called Butser Ancient Village, and I went really dragged there by my partner to hear storytelling in rounds of habitable barn-like structures made out of wattle and straw and God knows what.
Where is this place exactly?
This is just north of Portsmouth on the UK south coast.
So this is a relatively advanced settlement for the region.
Yes.
A big hello to all our listeners in Portsmouth. It was Adelaide last week, Portsmouth today. I'm doing really well. What were they telling stories about? I'm guessing not an awful lot was going on in Stone Age Portsmouth.
No, but they were telling stories about witches and fairies and superstitions in a kind of quite a dark, round sort of house, as I was saying, and it was strangely compulsive. It was, actually somebody telling you a story is something that doesn't really happen much in the multimedia age. So I found it quite different and quite enjoyable.
Latika, is there a seamless pivot from witches and fairies to the most recent thing I know you were at, because I was at it as well, i.e. the Globsec Forum in Prague? Did you meet any witches or fairies? Help me out here.
I'm struggling, Andrew. I'm really struggling with that one. No, other than to say that, of course, Prague is my favourite European city. And if you take a train, I reckon about 40 minutes outside of Prague, there is this amazing thing called the Bone Cathedral, where back in some godforsaken time where there was obviously a plague, they decided to decorate this cathedral with bones.
Why not?
And it is phenomenal. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. But unfortunately, Andrew did not get the chance to revisit the Bone Cathedral this trip because we were obviously at Globsec.
Prague is, however, fabulous, and hopefully, I don't know by what karmic adjustment what we were just, well, let's face it, what I just said about Portsmouth, we've made up for by being nice about Prague. But possibly just to extricate ourselves from this conundrum, we will start in the United States, where former and possibly future President Donald Trump appears to have survived another assassination attempt. Police in Florida have arrested one Ryan Wesley Ruth, whose first interaction with the law this is not. He was spotted and shot at by Secret Service agents protecting Trump as he prowled the undergrowth adjoining the Trump International Golf Course in Florida, armed with what has been described as an AK-47 style rifle. Judging by his social media postings, the suspect is a disappointed former fan of the 45th president, though also judging by his social media postings and indeed his self-published book, it may be a mistake to assume that his motivations or his plan were especially rigorously thought through. Latika, when things like this happen, and this is the second one of these in this campaign directed at Trump, but anything involving Americans and guns and high-profile people honestly almost makes my mind boggle that this doesn't happen more often, given that the smallest possible number you can think of in America of people who are really quite unhinged and extremely heavily armed run surely into the hundreds of thousands.
And obviously Donald Trump is not the only target for attack.
Indeed not.
We don't know about how many attacks are throttled and stymied before they take place against other candidates. And obviously the US president is a constant source of a target. I think there's a couple of things to point out here. One is, as soon as I saw that original assassination, which, can you believe, was at a time when Joe Biden was the president. And
feels like 100 years ago.
Right. We all thought that was going to be the game changer in this US election, and it's really turned out not to be the case. But nevertheless, when I saw that attack, I thought what we have here are the conditions for copycat, because this happens all across the world. It happens with terrorism. It happens with stabbings. We saw that in Australia a couple of months ago. I think we are seeing that now because the notoriety that somebody gets, and let's be honest, it's always usually young males who are perpetrating these sorts of things. They radicalise themselves online, and it doesn't take too much in the United States, as we know, to arm yourself with a weapon and have a go. So I think that's actually the big danger here, is we see people in those conditions who are susceptible to radicalisation think, hey, that's something that gets you 5 minutes of fame. Let's have a go.
It is a slightly older male in this case. He is 58. Within the last hour or so, he has now been charged with federal gun crimes, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon and possession of a firearm with an obstructed serial number. But Andrew, going back to what Latika said about the fact that, and she's right, the first assassination attempt on Trump does seem like something that happened circa the Civil War. Is it surprising how quickly everybody sort of zoned out of that? I mean, I know everyone talks a lot about the easily distracted, ceaselessly churning news cycle, but it seemed to have moved on from an attempt to assassinate the former president of the United States within about 72 hours.
Yes, I think it did move rapidly. And one of the sort of surprising and intriguing aspects of it was that there was a consensus that the impact of this first assassination attempt would be to push Trump up the polls considerably and create a sort of perfect conditions for him to win the elections. And then within 72 hours or thereabouts, it was suddenly no, Biden's been replaced by Kamala Harris. There's a new big story. And so the cycle goes on. So I suppose the question we should be asking now, how does assassination attempt number 2 change the rules of the game? Does it bring the focus of attention back to Trump in a big way? Or does it not really change anything?
I don't think it does. And I think one of the reasons why we all moved on so quickly was, yes, there was that big explosive knockout news that Biden is stepping down and it's Kamala Harris now. But I think the other thing that happened was that Trump had a window of opportunity there to use that assassination attempt. It clearly affected him. We could see an immediate change in him. Some of the members around him started to soften their rhetoric. We saw a really great statement from Melania Trump. For a moment, it almost looked like Trump could be humanised.
It was a very brief moment.
But, Andrew, it was brief and it did exist, if not briefly, if not fleetingly. And if it had continued, I would argue Trump would be in a very slam dunk position right now. But because of their own ill discipline, because of the way American politics is so hyperpolarized, I think they actually, through that advantage, and I don't want to be too crass about it because it was an assassination attempt and it's obviously something we should all condemn, but they did have a moment of opportunity to take something from that and grow it. And they were the ones who threw it in the bin. And I think the same thing is happening with this second attempt now. Because it's seen now in a political prism, well, then you're not going to shape or shift any undecided voters on this because everyone's come to this already decided.
On the subject of it being seen through a political prism, Andrew, Elon Musk, the nitwit proprietor of the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, is fairly obviously and unapologetically in the tank for Trump, which is obviously entirely his right. But his contribution to the discourse after this assassination attempt was to chuckle, and no one is even trying to assassinate Biden/Kamala. A tweet even he seems to have thought better of and since deleted. But it's not really helping, is it?
No. And I think, to state something that's probably been said many, many times, words matter. And there is, if you like, in the US electoral sort of arena at the moment, there is a lot of conspiracy theories. That's been one aspect of the Trump movement. So when you have real assassination attempts, the likelihood of a sort of crazy, politically polarized discourse, which takes over from, is candidate A's policies better than candidate B? That possibility for a kind of madhouse approach to elections is augmented. And I suppose, in history, there have been prior examples of it as well.
In related news, just before we move off this, Latika, one of Donald Trump's further contributions to the discourse over the weekend before this occurred, and there's no indication that he has subsequently recanted it, was to declare admittedly on his own social media website, so it's possible nobody actually saw it, that, and I quote, "I hate Taylor Swift."
You forgot all caps.
Obviously all in caps.
Obviously, I see. We just price in all caps these
taken
days.
as read, and all caps, to be clear, is always a fail-safe indicator of an ordered mind.
Indeed. What to say about this? I mean, the mind boggles. Taylor Swift, of course, is a huge sensation, a huge star. She's urged everyone to vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. I'm personally very, very dubious about celebrities getting involved in political endorsements in this way. We saw huge blockbuster endorsements for Hillary Clinton in 2016, including who I think was arguably the Taylor Swift of the time in Beyonce. And it didn't matter. And so I actually think it's a bit of a danger zone, because once you have celebrities picking a side, and it's usually the left and the Democrats, I actually think that plays very well into what the Republicans argue, which is they're all elites, they all look after themselves, we're one with you, we're the common man. Don't mind that we sit in Mar-a-Lago and then ride in gold elevators. We speak your language, common persons. So I'm not massively sure how much of a game changer that really is.
You think there might actually be political upside in enraging Taylor Swift's fervent legions, who are possibly the only grouping of people, and please, I say this with a certain amount of affection, even more unhinged than Trump's own supporters?
Well, that's a separate question, and the answer to that is decidedly no.
Well, to the South China Sea now, where China appears to have won what it will doubtless regard as a victory. After a standoff lasting some months, the Philippines has recalled to port the pride of its Coast Guard, BRP Teresa Magbanua, whose exhausted crew have suffered, as have many of their comrades, repeated water cannoning, ramming and other harassment by Chinese craft. At issue fundamentally is that where the South China Sea is concerned, China very much believes there is a clue in the name, while the Philippines, among other countries, contend that chunks of it belong to them. Here, first of all, recorded by CBS's 60 Minutes, is what it sounds like when a China Coast Guard ship clatters its Filipino equivalent.
Castle 134, Castle 134.
This alarm just went on the ship. We were told to wake up and put our life jackets on because we've just been rammed by a Chinese boat.
That from 60 Minutes on CBS. Andrew, first of all, we should be clear that where this is concerned, the law is repeatedly on everybody but China's side. There have been judgments in many international fora basically to boil away the legalese, suggesting that it is past time that China winds its neck in. But why is China not bothered or cowed by any of that?
My sort of supposition is that it sees a way to assert its regional power through pushing around fishing boats and steaming around various islands of different types. And it carries out a superpower calculation. What will I gain by doing this, and what's the cost of doing it? And I suppose the obvious conclusion is that Beijing believes it has more to gain than to lose, that the protests are likely not to hurt too much, and presumably, I'm not sure about this, that they won't escalate to immediately involve the United States directly. It's kind of like a slightly separate little fight going on.
But are there no costs to this kind of behaviour, Latika? It doesn't necessarily make China look like the friend-winning, influencing people sort of entity that anybody's really going to want to do business with.
Well, many countries still do business with China. What you're seeing here, I guess, grey zone activities where they're constantly pushing the envelope about just how far they can go in breaching international law, in behaving at sea in a very dangerous and reckless manner. And what you have so far is an inability from the Philippines and her allies, including the United States, at being able to stop this. And so for as long as China can continue, it will hail these victories and chalk up the wins, which it's had today. The question really is what happens in November in the United States, back to our previous conversation, because I think after November we'll have a much clearer landscape of what the cost of this behaviour in the South China Sea really means for China. We will see whether Donald Trump wants to stand up to China over the Philippines, if not Taiwan. And we will also see if it's Kamala Harris, whether she wants to be bolder than what the Biden administration has been, not just on Ukraine, but on the South China Sea. But for now, China is able to behave like this because it can get away with it. And that's really the answer, and that's really the conundrum for the West as it looks to deal with this.
Now, is there an amount here, Andrew, of China sort of poking around at the edges of the Philippines mutual defence treaty with the United States, much as Russia occasionally does vis-a-vis Article 5, just testing, reminding, occasionally asking, are you sure you're serious about this?
I get the impression that yes, that it's a kind of softening up process. Let's not have a confrontation, but let's just probe a little bit here and we'll probe a little bit there. Can we create a situation where the Filipino presence has departed, the ship has had to leave, there is a sort of a gap in which we move in, and then when the Filipinos come back, as they say they want to come back,
Indeed,
it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to control the area or to have influence in the area. So it's kind of, I would think, incremental way to test how others react and increase the overall Chinese presence.
Because, Latika, it's not hard to see what China is, if not actually, sort of daring people to do, because China well understands that the Philippines can't very well sink a Chinese Coast Guard ship, because that gets us into a whole other area pretty quickly. And I think the Philippines and China also both understand, if with varying amounts of happiness, that you're not going to see the United States scrambling fighter jets to start blowing up Chinese Coast Guard ships either. So that all being the case, what can the Philippines or indeed anybody else do to stop China doing this?
At the moment, it doesn't seem like we found a formula. And just back to, I guess, a broader point here, Andrew, when we talk about rules-based order, this is exactly the sort of thing we're talking about, conduct at sea in an area that the International Tribunal has ruled is within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Now, China doesn't like that ruling, so what does it do? It wants to go in and tear it up with brute force, with bullying, with aggressive behaviour. That is exactly what all this sometimes high-minded conversation about an international rules-based order means. So it's up to the Philippines and it's up to the West, if they really do believe in upholding that rules-based order, to find out a way to uphold it. And so far, it's very clear that we've not found a way or a capability of doing this. Keep in mind, this comes after Jake Sullivan just travelled, it's the US National Security Advisor, just travelled to the United States and spent days there discussing issues exactly like this. So even after these talks, even after that relationship between the United States and Beijing is showing some signs of stabilisation, you might say, we still have these very, very fundamental challenges in the South China Sea. And if China is successful in, I guess, strong-arming the Philippines, well, then the United States really has to ask itself what its own force, what its guarantees, what its treaty alliances mean to the rest of its allies.
Well, to Mexico now, where the Senate has approved one bequest of outgoing President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, an overhaul of Mexico's judiciary which will allow voters to elect judges at all levels up to and including the Supreme Court. The motion just cleared the two-thirds majority required for constitutional tweaks, though not without an amount of brouhaha. The Senate chamber was stormed by protesters seeking to make the case that the point of appointed judges is that they serve as a check on the whims of the elected legislative and or executive branches. Andrew, first of all, is this now a completely done deal? Is this actually definitely happening?
It's happening, but it's not 100% done. So what's happened is they've passed what's called a primary law, which introduces the direct election of judges, but they haven't yet passed the secondary law, which gets much more into the detail of how the system is going to work. And there are very major questions about how the system will work. It basically will affect 7,000 judges, all of the judges in Mexico. A lot of them are likely to retire. And there are major doubts about their ability to remain independent if they, if you like, owe their allegiance to political parties and electoral coalitions.
Just to follow that up quickly, though, is it necessarily cynical to interpret this as AMLO's parting revenge on the judiciary, who have, well, the judiciary have done what they're supposed to do, basically, with rumbustious populists and stopped him doing exactly as he pleases?
I think that is very much the situation. He publicly says the whole point is to democratize the system of justice and to get rid of the old establishment ruling class, the right-wing conservative parties. And it has to be said that the existing justice system is not terribly good. It's under-resourced. It is open to corruption and various things of that type. The counter-argument is that the new system that's being brought in will suffer for all those things, and perhaps even increasingly so. Drug money finds its way into the decisions made by judges right now. But under the new system, it will really continue doing so in many people who follow the influence of the drug trafficking cartels.
Latika, as a general principle, if we are permitted to elect any Yahoo to our parliaments, should we be permitted or encouraged to elect any Yahoo to our courts?
No, not ideally, but it is a problem when you do have corruption in the system. I mean, and look at the United States. You have a Supreme Court there stacked with Republicans handing down verdicts on things like Roe v. Wade, overturning social norms and what's been accepted for decades. So it is a problem if the politicians themselves can't be trusted to appoint good judges. So maybe there is, I think, a halfway house here where you have independent bodies that are loosely associated with the government, but certainly not a popular vote. I mean, the idea of Joe Blow even knowing their political candidate, let alone their judicial one, just strikes me as mind-boggling. And it is one of those schemes where you look at from a distance and think, gee, what could possibly go wrong?
Is it not usually wise, though, when you start thinking of politicians who make a thing of teeing off at the judiciary, and one thinks at this point of Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, Silvio Berlusconi. I mean, a pattern emerges, doesn't it?
It certainly does. That's not to say that the judiciary always gets it right. And again, I look to, point to what's happening in the United States. But that's clearly a system where the SCOTUS has been rigged. So we know the outcome of that. No, I don't think any of these systems are foolproof, of course. And the rot usually starts from the top if you're in a position like this. But I'm not sure that opening it up to every Tom, Dick and Harry is a good idea either.
Andrew, famously, the countries of Latin America are very receptive to the United States telling them how they should organise their affairs. But nevertheless, the US ambassador to Mexico, Ken Salazar, and the US has been extremely unhappy with this move, has said that it could allow, as he put it, criminals to exploit politically motivated and inexperienced judges. Is he wrong about that?
No, I don't think he's wrong. And in response to him saying that, the Mexican president, AMLO, said he was installing a freeze on ambassador-level relations, really for the rest of his presidency, which runs for another 2 weeks or so. And it falls to Claudia Sheinbaum, the new president-elect, who's from the same party as AMLO, to begin to unravel that particular diplomatic mess. I should also tell you very quickly that there are some major organizational problems facing the proposed changes to the judiciary. Not least, the elections are supposed to happen in 2025, when half the judges will be elected, and 2027 when the other half will be elected. The Mexican Electoral Institute, which is being closed down by the outgoing president, says that in Mexico City alone, something like 150 judges need to be elected from potentially 90 to 100,000. And no one has quite thought through the logistics of how this vote is going to work, with some people saying that each ballot will take about 45 minutes to laboriously work through and write down the candidate names. And with some sort of perverse approach, the electoral districts for the election of judges will not be the same as the electoral districts for everything else, introducing another level of complications. So it could be a bit of a time bomb for the incoming president, who supports a policy, but she will have to deal with the practical difficulties, which will be quite significant.
Well, giddy times now for anybody who got, around the beginning of 2024, decent odds on one of this year's headlines being an outbreak of hostilities between Spain and Portugal. Over the weekend, Portugal's Defence Minister, Nuno Melo, demanded the return from Spain of Olivenza, a settlement of some 12,000 souls in Spain's southwest, which did belong to Portugal before Spain helped itself during the 1801 War of the Oranges, which, to be clear, was not actually fought with oranges. Portugal has always officially disputed Spain's claim to Olivenza, but Melo cited the Treaty of Alcanisas signed in 1297. But until now, at least, Portugal has never really made too big a thing of it on the grounds that nobody really cares all that much. Apart from the Defence Minister, apparently, Latika, delightfully, I read in the last hour or so, and I quote, Melo has since clarified that his remarks do not reflect the official stance of Portugal's government led by Luis Montenegro. How much do we wish we had a recording of that phone call?
As an Australian, Andrew, I struggle with this story because I'm kind of thinking, what part of the world do we not care about that we could perhaps claim as our own territory? And all I've come up with is Tasmania and New Zealand. I mean,
Tasmania, it's kind of already ours, isn't it?
Yeah, but we don't want it.
A big hello.
We'd be quite happy if it just wasn't part of it.
I was going to say a big hello to our listeners in Tasmania, but as of just now, Latika, we no longer have any. This is a fabulous story. I also like the fact that Melo, Latika, asserted or was quick to reassure that this is not a provocation.
Indeed.
What do you think he was doing here, really, apart from trying to get his name in the papers?
I have no idea. I mean, I just think this is such a bizarre story from woe to go. But I do like the general attitude of just not caring.
Well, indeed. And Andrew, as of this broadcast, Spain's government, and I've checked, is yet to respond, which I actually think is kind of funnier than buying into it and sort of summoning the ambassador and issuing angry denunciations.
I think diplomatic silence might be a really good approach to this. I do also feel that, Latin America in particular has its long history of unsolved disputes and old grudges. For example, concerning the Panama hat, which is not from Panama, but it was made in Ecuador. And a lot of these just continue year after year.
We have these disputes. I mean, who made the pavlova? Who's the original
obviously.
architect of the flat white? Don't ask a Kiwi.
Australia, obviously.
Or the Lamington. Australia,
again, obviously.
Oh, this is controversial stuff, Andrew. Not the Australian Andrew, just for listeners.
There's also... What you're saying does ring true, though, Latika, about trying to see these things as an Australian, because it does occur to me fairly frequently when I try and report on other things elsewhere that it's really hard to get away from the degree to which where you grew up informs the way you look at the world. And if you are fortunate enough, as we both were, to be raised on our own vast continental island fortress in the middle of nowhere with no natural predators, I always find that
what do you mean, no natural predators? I had brown snakes every single year, jumping in my pool.
I mean, apart from, the ones we live with, sort of foreign predators who may covet our territory.
All right, I'm back with you.
But I always get that thing of, trying to understand some arcane European or Latin American border dispute. You just find yourself thinking, God, who cares?
Yeah. I remember the first time I stood in a country with land borders and was just so overwhelmingly wowed. And the company I was with was European, and they're like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "There's another country. Just look straight over there." And they're like, "Yes, we know.
You just walk over there, and the money and the stamps will be different." And I know it's absolutely insane. Do you think it's also possible, though, Andrew, that one of the reasons Spain has kept its yap shut so far is, aside from it being the funnier thing to do, it's obviously that Spain, it's not like it's without a record of pointing at bits of land adjoining it and saying, we want that back?
Yes, I think Spain has a long history of land that it wants back. Something of, large parts of the United States were once more aligned with Spain than anywhere else. So yes, if border and historical disputes are hornets' nests, don't stir them up unnecessarily.
No, and I think, Letico, would it be nice if the attitude caught on more of the mayor of Olivenza, Jos Gonzalez Andrade, who basically told the Portuguese defence minister to knock it off and just said, everyone's happy with how it is, it's fine, shut up?
Well, I feel like that's what we should do with Western Australia, which every few years gets very excited about seceding. And because they have all the iron ore wealth in Australia, if they actually did secede, the rest of Australia would be in quite a quandary.
I think, as long as we're just alienating people here, let's go nuts.
Let's go.
One of possibly my favourite Australian historical fact is, I think in 1932, Western Australia actually held a referendum on secession and voted to secede, and the rest of us ignored them.
Correct. We all just said, nah.
Yeah, thanks for your input.
It was a bit of the pat on the head, wasn't it?
Yeah, we'll get back. See,
hello to all our Perth listeners.
It's too late now, but a model perhaps for how Brexit could have been handled. Latika Burke and Andrew Thompson, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, few, if any, countries have undergone such dramatic changes in the last 80-odd years as China. The foundation of the People's Republic and subsequent upheavals and reinventions are mind-boggling in scale and therefore ripe for the journalistic technique of telling a big story by telling a small one. Edward Wong, the New York Times diplomatic correspondent and former Beijing correspondent, tells his own, that of a US citizen of Chinese descent, and his father's, that of a People's Liberation Army soldier patrolling China's western frontiers, in a new book called At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China. I spoke to Edward at Midori House earlier and began by asking whether, when he was growing up in Washington, D.C., his father had ever spoken much of his previous life.
When I was growing up, I knew my father as a somewhat distant figure, even though he was present in our lives daily. He worked in a restaurant, very long hours. I rarely spoke to him about his past, and we would just try and find time to have a bit of fun together on the one day he had off each week. So we didn't talk a lot about his past. And I started probing more deeply into it when I was in my 20s, when I was in graduate school in America, because I was then studying the Chinese language, studying Chinese politics and society. And I went to find out how the history of China had imprinted itself on my parents and how it had changed the course of their lives. And so I learned at that time that my father had been in the Chinese army in the first decade of Mao's rule of China. So I thought that was fascinating. He showed me a photograph of himself in an army uniform. And I think that image of him has remained fixed in my mind ever since. And after I finished my nearly decade of work for the New York Times in China and moved back to Washington, I wanted to interview my father in depth about his time in the army, and that was what motivated me to use his narrative as the major arc for the book.
Was this a tough sell to your dad? Like you were saying, he was a fairly reserved figure who didn't talk much about this period, and it may be that thing which to him didn't seem all that interesting because it was just his life, and it was not a life terribly dissimilar to that of hundreds of millions of people in some respects. But certainly I think in the context of the modern day, and it's testament to the storytelling as well, but it does come across as the most extraordinary adventure he had.
Yeah, it's amazing. The narrative of his life is in China, in the People's Republic of China, is a coming-of-age tale. It's a journey. It takes you across the sweep of China from the south to the northeast in Manchuria to the northwest in Xinjiang, where the Uyghur Muslims and the Kazakh Muslims live. And I thought that arc of his journey across China and then back to his birthplace of Hong Kong could allow me to tell the story of China and also frame China as this modern-day empire, an empire that has reconstituted itself from the fall of the Qing Empire. And in his mind, he wasn't reluctant to talk about it once I started interviewing him about it. But I think when I was growing up, he had put it far in his past and he was intent on building a life in America. But now that he's older, when I interviewed him, he was in his late 80s, going into his 90s. And I think that he felt there was a value in terms of relating that part of his life to myself and to future generations, because I think he felt that there were lessons to be learned from it, and that the arc of his journey in China was also the arc of history under Mao and could inform people about current day events in China as well.
Well, one of the linkages between his story and yours is you go to some of the places where he served, and those are obviously places where the Chinese Communist Party, I guess, governs even more intently than it does in other parts of China. Just from a practical point of view, how difficult was it to get access to Xinjiang as a journalist?
It varied over time. My first journey to Xinjiang was not as a journalist, but as a backpacker who was traveling across Asia overland. I went from Hong Kong to India and stopped in Xinjiang because I wanted to see some of the places that my father had started mentioning to me. And back then, there was easy access to parts of Xinjiang. I could get on buses, go to places even near the borders with other countries, the border with Russia, the border with Kazakhstan. And that got steadily harder over time as I worked as a journalist in China. So I covered very intense ethnic riots in Xinjiang in 2009. There was lots of government control of where journalists could go at that time because of the violence that had just taken place. But we were still able to move around neighborhoods in the capital, Urumqi, and interview people. And then as the government put in place harder and harder policies to try and control the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, it became harder for us to move around freely in towns and cities that were mostly non-Han Chinese. And my last visit to Xinjiang in 2016, I went to Kashgar, which is this very remote oasis town that's closer to Baghdad than it is to Beijing. And I was followed immediately by police officers in Kashgar. It became very difficult for me to interview people because of that.
Because, again, there's the parallel narratives of the book. There's the change your father sees in the time that he serves in the PLA before he eventually decides that he wants to make his way out of China. And there's the changes you observe from your first posting there for the New York Times in 2008, and I think you're there till 2016.
That's correct.
How much, even in that quite short period, did you feel like China had changed?
It changed dramatically. I mean, I came into China at a time when it was taking its place on the world stage as a superpower.
This is the Olympic year as well, right?
The Olympic year. And I think everyone remembers that, the Summer Olympics in Beijing. And it was also the year when there was this huge financial crash that began in the United States, and they gave China a sense of self-confidence. They gave the party and the government a sense of self-confidence that China perhaps had the right system to compete with the U.S., to take its place as a superpower on par with the U.S. and with other industrialized nations. And that sense of self-confidence in the party, I think, allowed it to become more authoritarian in many ways going forward from the late Hu Jintao era, the predecessor to Xi Jinping, and into the Xi era. It also gave it the self-confidence to project power on the global stage and to undergo a rapid military buildup. So I think that there was a great change in the character of China and in its place in the world during that period that I covered it.
So this is where I guess it brings in that word that rather leaps out of the title of the book, which is empire. And you do posit this idea that Xi has a certain wistfulness for the Qing dynasty in particular and what it represented. We are, of course, living in a Europe which is learning the hard way that imperial nostalgia can die hard. Do you see any difference between Xi's wistfulness for the Qing dynasty and Putin's for the Russia of Peter the Great?
I think that there are strong parallels between Xi and Putin in terms of that thinking.
That's encouraging.
Right, yeah. Let's hope that Xi makes wiser decisions than Putin has done. But I think that Xi understands the history of the Qing Empire. I mean, currently, China controls much of what the Qing held, and that's why it has to hold on to Xinjiang and Tibet with great force and parts of Mongolia as well. But when it looks east to Taiwan, for example, Taiwan was a part of the Qing Empire, and then it has never been ruled by the communists. The nationalists, of course, fled to Taiwan when they lost the Civil War. I think that fixation, both with the Qing Empire and with this unfinished business from the Civil War, is fixated in Xi's mind. And so he's been talking a lot about Taiwan. And of course, it's the biggest flashpoint in U.S.-China relations at the current moment. And Xi has also talked privately and in party meetings about the breakup of the Soviet Union. It weighs heavily on him. And I think Putin's vision of an imperial Russia and of Soviet Russia is very much imprinted in Xi's head. And he thinks that the Soviet Union and Gorbachev made a huge mistake by loosening its grip on the various regions of China. And he is intent on not doing that. And I think he sees Putin as trying to reinvigorate or reclaim that imperial power for Moscow. And in a way, he understands that, I think, and he sees a parallel with his own efforts to exert power across China and along its frontiers.
That was Edward Wong, diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times. Edward's tremendous book, At the Age of Empire, is available now. Very much recommended. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to our panellists today, Latika Burke and Andrew Thompson. Today's show was produced by Anita Ryota and researched by Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.